This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody. This day, January 25th, 1845, the 28th U.S. Congress passed, quote, an act to establish a uniform time for holding elections for electors of president and vice president in all the states of the Union, which, of course, that day, as we all know, was designated as, quote, the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Sure, why not? The Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And here we are. That is still, to this day, Election Day. So let's talk about how we got to that. Let's ask that question, why Tuesday? Here to answer, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
There's actually a grassroots group called and a bit of a movement called Why Tuesday, and it's one of these sort of voting reform groups that has been asking this question for a while and advocating for changes. And so, we should get to that because it's a real question. But before we describe Why Tuesday and this law and what happened in 1845 to solidify it, I think it's important to know kind of what elections looked like just before that in the 1840s, because when you understand that, you do get the impulse to say, no, we should just pick one day and make it pretty simple.
So the Constitution had kind of left deciding how elections were going to be run up to Congress, especially for establishing a date for when presidential elections would happen. And for a long time, it ran anywhere from like a couple of weeks to a month. In the election of 1844, the election lasted from November 1st to December 4th. And it seems like that worked well enough in the first few decades of the country, but some things had changed in the meantime. There was universal white male suffrage, so now you had tons more voters than you had had in those early years of the Republic. The nation had gotten bigger and news was moving faster. And so suddenly you were having these elections where if your state was voting like late in the cycle, you might already have the results from other states. So you would know like, man, my vote's going to be wasted, or wow, everybody needs to get the supporters of this guy together so that we can make sure that we can overcome the votes in Vermont or what have you. So they figured out it was becoming a pretty, just bad system.
Yeah. And a system like ripe for fraud because people would figure out, like who was leading or trailing. And they would, dress up in another way, disguise, cast a vote again, go over to another town, cast a vote again. It's not as though they had, like ID laws. So you could very easily, or registration for that matter.
Yeah.
So you could very easily cast your ballot multiple times. And in some cases, in some races, they had like more ballots cast than people actually living in that town, which is kind of wild.
Well, there's a couple terms for these folks who would go and vote in one place and go in another. So they would call them floaters, who were the ones who crossed across state lines to vote. And then pipe laying was the name of the practice, because people who were floating back and forth and voting multiple times were told to say that they were in town to lay pipe and they were just there as construction workers. I have to indulge the juvenile side of my mind and just point out that floaters and laying pipe mean very, very different things in 2024 than they did back then. But we can just keep it moving.
Yes.
Oh, man.
But nevertheless, it is chaos. And, a lot of time, and this is where you get those pictures of those like classic Tammany Hall style elections where they're just like bussing people in and they're just coming from everywhere. And especially immigrants, coming right off the boat and being told to go and vote for this, right away. And so.
Yeah. And I think that anxiety around immigrants, because it is an era where you're starting to get more both German and Irish immigration, especially Irish immigration in the 1840s, seeing all of these new Irish voters going into the courthouses. There was just like going into the voting places. It gave it a feel that this was a little bit out of control and somebody needed to rein it in somehow.
Mm-hmm. So one last thing, and this isn't exactly the crux of this conversation, and I know the constitutional scholars out there will kind of maybe have something to say about this, but you did mention that the Constitution does not weigh in and say this is how elections should be conducted. And it largely leaves it to, and I would say kind of my sense is like defers to the states, but defers mostly out of just like, we've got a lot of stuff to figure out as we're writing this thing and we can't get to everything. And so let's just let the states figure it out. And, maybe
figure it out.
Maybe that's wrong, but I kind of, in my understanding of this, that sort of seems like the spirit of it, that they could have weighed in, I suppose, and said this is how you should conduct elections. And it just makes you realize, like, gosh, here we are sitting all these years later, and the very fact that it's up to every individual state to kind of figure out how they conduct their elections is like being weaponized and screwed up in like such consequential ways right now. And it might largely have been because like they were a little tired and they didn't get around to just like writing that paragraph.
But also so much of like the rules or laws around voting are so obsolete now. I mean, so much of these decisions were based off of the fact that America was mostly agricultural, and it was a society built off farming and the harvest and planting season and things that we don't plan our lives around anymore. Yeah. And so there hasn't been much room for changing sort of like how the culture operates.
Nope. You have all of these archaic rules and laws, and that idea of like election administration happening at not just the state level, but at the local precinct level. Yeah. And in this case, like Congress doesn't have a huge role when it comes to federal elections, but the one thing they can do is they can set the date. And they just didn't do that for the first 50 years or so, which is kind of amazing.
So here we go to this moment that we're marking here, 1845, when they do set the date, and we get to ask our key question throughout this episode, why Tuesday? And there actually is a reason for Tuesday as opposed to the other days. There's no football
sort of
that night.
Legitimate reason, too.
Yeah. Legitimate for 1845.
Yes.
Which is to say, like, you couldn't do it on the weekend because people were going to church. You couldn't do it from Wednesday to Friday because that's when farmers took their goods to market. And so that really only left you, like, Monday or Tuesday. And so Tuesday is kind of the day that they zeroed in on. And again, I just want to underscore that it made sense for the time. Very archaic for how we think about how democracy might function today.
Yeah. I think on Mondays was sort of reserved for accountants to sort of like work their books and things of that nature. And so they were like, Tuesday, nobody's got anything going on Tuesday.
And to travel, right? I mean, if you're working all the way through Sunday and travel is so slow and you have to get from your rural farm into the polling precinct, that might take you a day. And so you can't be there on Monday morning to vote, but you could be there on Tuesday morning to vote. And then the same kind of largely goes for the November-ness of it all, which is the kind of sweet spot between planting season and harvest before it's too cold. And so, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November just kind of makes sense from an agrarian standpoint.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
And you have to do that because November 1st is a big holy day in Catholicism. And so you would be shutting Catholics out if you had it on November 1st. And so that's why it's always the first Tuesday after the first Monday. Because if it ever landed on the first day of November, then you'd have a real problem. Right. So again, little pretzel.
Yeah, December's too cold. January's too cold. I mean, I also think about fact that if you have someone, like say the president, who is elected in November, you don't have a whole lot of time to get your cabinet together to get, like, before inauguration comes. Like, there are a lot of changes that need to happen before you're actually sworn
it's interesting. Because, I
in.
think people are starting to question that, too. And we've done an episode about, I think, or at least touched on that, why is Inauguration Day 2 months later? And, a lot of that, I think, was also, like, travel was slower. And so, yes, like, you want a certain, you want a senator from Missouri to be in your cabinet. Well, you got to write him a letter. The letter's got to get there. They got to they got to get out, Whereas, I don't know, I've heard, I think, pretty compelling arguments, or at least reasonable questions about, like, we could probably do this thing in a couple weeks, and just take over and move in and take over. But I don't know.
But also remember, at this point in time, Inauguration Day is like March 4th.
That's true. Oh, yeah, that's the episode.
And so it's not until the
later,
1930s.
And then they moved it.
That it becomes January.
I'm glad someone's remembering the episodes we did.
Well, but what's so interesting, though, now is because during that period, too, the federal government gets so much bigger. Mm-hmm. Now you actually kind of need those 2 months in order to put together an entire government. Could you imagine if it's 2 weeks? Like, you've barely gotten the balls organized, much less like your cabinet.
Yeah.
There's no way. There's no way.
And in here we also get some of these rules, although there's more that come in over the decades of, like, when the Electoral College gets formally voted, the first Monday after December 12th, and Congress ratifies, and I think we all learned the kind of date around those kinds of things 4 years ago. But yeah, there's this whole kind of codified process that kicks in after you set that election day. All right. So that's when it got set. As we've pointed out many times, it was a long time ago for very different reasons. What do we make of the way that we do it now? Do you, and I guess I have two questions. I mean, one, I think there is a big push to ask why Tuesday, and and kind of ask the questions we were asking here. I think that a lot of people point out that in a lot of other countries, it's both administered differently, and there's a voting week, or this happens on a weekend, even.
Or it's a national holiday.
Or it's a national holiday, which I think is sort of the lowest hanging fruit and most obvious one, no matter what day of the week it is. But it is also the case, in part because of this sort of weird quirk that states can administer their own elections, that for a lot of folks now, voting does happen over the course of days, if not weeks. And so, we may have gotten to a point now, sort of like unengineering or unengineering this sort of weird system, where it is the case that for a lot of Americans, early voting, vote by mail, it does feel like there's a voting period. And so maybe we don't even need to rejigger that first Tuesday after the first Monday.
I think it's fine to leave the first Tuesday after the first Monday as the deadline. But I think that the problem with any sort of national election day is that we're just too big of a country for everyone in the country who's eligible to vote to be able to get to the polls in the exact same 24-hour window. So this idea of having a much longer voting period, that makes a lot of sense to me. It makes a lot of sense to me to remember that Congress had a role to play in all of this, and so maybe Congress could have more of a role to play in voting more generally. And I don't know, it seems like there's been a real push and pull when it comes to elections in the United States between opening access and closing access, and that's kind of what we're seeing play out right now. And when people are allowed to vote, how long of a voting period they have is a huge part of that.
I mean, to me, in a democracy, it seems like you would want to make voting as widely accessible as possible. If this is the greatest tool that the people have for electing their officials, that giving it a month and giving people time to sort of vote at their leisure, making it a national holiday, making it for people to be easily registered. All of the sort of barriers that we put in front of voting, to me, I think are worth questioning. But certainly not making it a holiday, or not making it where someone has to sort of like take time off work in order to do it. I think people sometimes have to make hard decisions, and most of the time, if they know that they're going to lose hours or wages or time or childcare or something to go vote, it's not going to be something that they prioritize.
It's a poll tax.
Yeah.
And it is kind of stunning. I mean, if you go and look at, a list on, you can find it on Wikipedia of kind of election days around the world, I mean, basically every single country is a Sunday, and if it's not, in the rare cases it's not, it's a holiday. And then you get down to the United States, which alphabetically is at the end of the list, and it's just like this really weird thing. So yeah.
I think that we should take a page from Australia. As you know, Australia has mandatory voting, although you can submit a blank ballot if you want to protest that, and that still counts. But after you vote, they give you a sausage sandwich. And I think we should be handing out more sausage sandwiches. I feel like that would be good for democracy.
At the very
we could
least,
have like
donuts.
Beyond sausage.
Oh my gosh.
There. Now, I like that kind of out of the box, in the box thinking.
No, I know, but you just like... That actually would be like the most American answer to all this. Is like, we're not going to give you a federal holiday, but Dunkin' Donuts has agreed.
Brought to you by Dunkin'.
A corporate backer has stepped in to solve what Congress cannot. Yeah.
Democracy runs on Dunkin'.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right.
Count me in for 2 votes.
Right, exactly. Yeah. She's all of a sudden, we've got a floater here. All right.
Oh, man.
Let's leave it there and let's go on to some also on this days. So here's some other things that happened on this day, January 25th.
In 1961, President John F. Kennedy becomes the first U.S. president to hold a live television news conference.
And 20 years later, in 1981, the 52 Americans held hostage by Iran for 444 days arrived in the United States. The flight was timed so that the hostages were able to watch the Super Bowl at their hotel, which, again, a very American set of priorities.
Yeah. Wait.
Because that's the first thing you want when you get out.
Well, you missed last year's, so...
Man.
And it's... I wonder if there were Eagles fans on that flight. That's who they lost in the Super Bowl there to the Raiders, and I wonder if they probably overshadowed by the fact that they got home.
It's been the worst year and a half.
Yeah, this is the worst day of my life.
Oh, man.
And this day in 2017, January 25th. This is the day that Trump really kicked his immigration enforcement into high gear, issuing a bunch of executive actions, fulfilling some of those contentious pledges, including the so-called Muslim ban and the border wall, and deportation. And, to me, and we've talked about maybe doing an episode around this or some other moments there, but to me, that January 25th, 2017 is also seared in my day as a real day of, like, action. And I remember, living in New York, there were like lawyers at JFK and protests everywhere, but it felt like not that long into the administration, a real sense of like people are going to hit the streets in a way. And, frankly, like I remember my thought is like the lawyers are going to get after it. I just remember that. It felt like a real mobilization of do-gooder lawyers in that moment. But anyway, that's a few also on this days for January 25th. Reminder that we are going to be compiling some of these in our newsletter. We have a new whole exciting newsletter relaunch planned for later this winter. So go sign up for our newsletter at thisdaypod.com, where you can find all sorts of other stuff as well. But we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.